you. Thank you for joining this interesting and exciting conversation. My name is Benga Additional. I think to seed the atmosphere, I would begin with a poem by the great Yusuf Komunyakaa called Ode to the Drum, and then we will take it from there and do wonderful things. Ode to the Drum. Gazelle, I killed you for your skin's exquisite touch, for how easy it is to be nailed to a board, weathered raw as white butcher paper. Last night, I heard my daughter praying for the meat here at my feet. You know, it wasn't hunger that made me stop my heart to the harm I felt. Weeks ago, I broke you as a woman once shattered me into a song beneath our weight. Before you slouched into that grassy hush, but now I'm tightening lashes, shaping hide as if around a rib cage stretched like 5 bowstrings. Ghosts cannot slip back inside the body's drum. You've been seasoned by wind, dusk, and sunlight. Pressure can make everything whole again. Brass nails tackled into the ebony wood, your face has been carved 5 times. I have to drive trouble from the valley, trouble in the hills, trouble on the river too. There is no kola nut, palm wine, fish, salt, or calabash. Kadum, 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 kadum. Now I have beaten a song back into you. Rise and walk away like a panther. Ooh. Okay, this is Long Talk. Long Talk is a project of a Longhouse. A Longhouse is a new journal that will be a frontier for critical thought, thinking, arts, and aesthetic across the Black diaspora. A Long Talk is the project we have conceived to create an archive of Black discourse, Black intelligence, Black joy, Black resistance, Black tenderness, Black craft, across the sea, across the diasporas. When the great Baldwin met with the great Achebe, Baldwin said, "This is my brother who 400 years has prevented us from meeting." This is the kind of spirit guiding these conversations, the series of conversations we're going to have. We're hoping to create an archive of Black geniuses, Black artists, Black writers, Black poets, Black musicians in conversation.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and for this opportunity. And I hope it goes well. As I've warned you, this could be, inaugural events can either make or break them. So I'm hoping that we do a good job for you guys. I also want to just note that the effort in conception of thinking of the African diaspora as a whole and making these connections across the Black experience makes both intellectual and emotional sense, I think, and I think it's a good thing. A good thing to pursue. So I'm glad to be involved. Your question is interesting because the two terms have come together in different ways. Intimacy is a curious word because I think the idea of intimacy has this idea of centering the thought around subjectivity, around the individual's relationship to other individuals, that dynamic of relationship. And then intimacy would seem to me to suggest a certain kind of stake, a certain kind of personal stake in whatever articulation and whatever things we are engaged in. And I think for poets in the 20th century and the 21st century, we are constantly navigating this problem of the individual self, vis-a-vis the larger collective, the larger public. And especially African writers and writers of the African diaspora, writers involved in struggle, or at least in conversation with ideas of struggle. This dynamic operates both as a tyranny, that is the tyranny of individualism, And another side of that tyranny is the tyranny of commitment to community, the sort of artist at the mercy of the community and or at the service of the community. We are constantly wrestling with that question, and every articulation, every sentence that we make, every construction. If Bob Marley says, this morning I woke up in the curfew, oh God, I was a prisoner too, could not recognize the faces standing over me. They were all dressed in uniforms of brutality, which is his first articulation in that song, Burning. The next stanza says, how many rivers do we have to cross? He has to make that bridge between the individual moment and the collective moment. And he's constantly doing that, wrestling both conflictedly and also productively. The very Jamaican idea of I and I is a construction that involves the individual, I and I, that is me and myself, and I and I being me and the community. I think it's a very Black condition born of slavery, born of oppressive structures, but also born of the rich and positive construction of the role of the individual in society, which I think is interesting. So if we place this idea of intimacy in that context, I think we're dealing with something quite fascinating and quite vexing at the same time. And then there's that phrase, the archive, the idea of the archive. I think Chris Abani is somebody who has talked a lot about the work we do with African Poetry Books, Book Fund, the idea of creating a living archive, which is curious, because the idea of an archive is that it is something that is encountered in retrospect. That is, the archive collects what has happened. Therefore, it's time past that is being curated and collected. So that if you say we are looking at an intimate living archive, then we are also recognizing that in the process of producing work, writing work, we are doing so with a consciousness that we are adding to an existing archive, because the archive is a political force. It's a force of identity and place. It's a force that works against silence and erasure. And for Black people, that gesture is hugely important in terms of survival, because we are working against the idea of erasure. So when we build archives, but do so in a living moment, which is to say that when I write, I'm both writing to articulate the thing for the moment, but also adding to something that is a tradition. I think when we combine that concept, we are also involved in doing something quite both problematic, complex, but also essential. So those terms, that's how I would begin to think about those terms. And I think these are terms that shape my own sort of raison d'etre. What am I? Who am I? What am I doing in this world? What am I as an artist? And I have to accept that both things operate. I can't separate them. So that's how I would begin to think about it.
Thanks, Kwame. It's a lot to think about. And thank you, Yinka and Benga, for convening this. It's a tremendous honor to get to chat with Kwame, and it's interesting. We rarely get to talk like this, except in a context like this one. I was thinking about, and now my thoughts about the Intimate Archive are much more complicated. But I was thinking about the Intimate Archive in two ways. The idea of an Intimate Archive is as in the tangible sense, being, I think it was Bell Hooks' essay about the photo galleries that Black families keep in the hallway, right? And so there's this intimate archive of where our imagery and self-imagery has been curated out, has been under erasure in larger institutions. At home, we have much greater agency over how we construct the story of ourselves, the physical representations of the stories of ourselves. The tangible also being in the texts, the work that we actually produce, and film, and of course music, as Kwame is pointing out. The intangible of the Intimate Archive is kind of where, and it's funny you read that blurb from Major Jackson where he calls me a metaphysician. And I've long kind of wondered what does it mean to be an American metaphysician or even a contemporary metaphysician. The way that I have kind of defined it for myself is by saying that I'm deeply interested in what is unspoken, what is, but nonetheless very present and practically tangible in Kwame talks about the self and other. So one of my projects, my academic project, I'm really interested in in visual agency. And so I start from this idea that what is dangerous to white supremacy, to Eurocentrism, to patriarchy, perhaps even, is when we claim the right to look, when we claim the right to witness, and historically, I think this is one of the things that has been most actively kind of suppressed and fought against, and to the point where I think one of the perhaps most effective means of oppression is to make us as people and us as artists self-conscious about what we see and how we look and how we witness. The most kind of concrete example of that being the reckless eyeballing, right? The crime for which Emmett Till was murdered, the supposed crime, right? And we discovered much later that that wasn't even,
yes, yeah.
It didn't even happen, right? So there is an understanding, right? There is something that takes place. Actually, I also want to connect sorry, one second. My daughter is trying to sneak through here. I also want to connect the idea of the curse of Ham to this, right? So Ham, and this being, again, the biblical justification. Ham is cursed for what he is seeing, right? And so there's this narrative, this biblical narrative that we share that is part of our intimate archive, right? That goes certainly, when we talk amongst Black folks, we know this story, and when I talk to white folks about it, it's often a surprise. Oh, I'd never heard of the curse of Ham being a justification for slavery. And
you're talking to the wrong white folk.
I'm talking to the yes. But my argument is even that they do know this.
Yeah.
Right? Whether you are articulating, whether you can sort of recall the story, and articulate it, it is very much a part of our intimate archive, and it is very much present and active in conditioning the ways that we interact, the ways that we think about one another. And so I come back finally to the Du Boisian notion of double consciousness, which is the I and I, right? And so if on the one hand, if I'm, there are very real consequences for my demonstration of visual agency in the world. There are very real, police will respond violently for my simple demonstration of visual agency. I see you, I am present, right? This can provoke wildly over-the-top reactions in some folks. So I know it's real in the world, what I contend with is that the extent to which that self-consciousness is internalized, right? The extent to which I carry that intimate archive into my own work and into my own writing practice, and the extent to which I allow it, or I'm even conscious of it, and this is the struggle for me, is making it legible, consistently making it legible to me in my writing practice, that this idea of limitation was given to me. This is not something I devised, and it may not be something that is even productive. So in this idea of the kind of metaphysician, I'm really interested in what is shared, what we share as assumptions about how we commonly see the world and how we shape the world in our imaginations. And how what of that I take back to my writing desk that is empowering, that is affirming, and useful to me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. The right to look, the right to witness, the right to listen. And I'm thinking of that relationship between orality and textuality in Black archives as it relates also to both of your works. So I'll begin with Kwame again, then we'll come to Greg. So Kwame goes, and this project of his changed my life. It's so important to me. Wisteria, right? As against the notion of the Western canon, especially after Oma and Co. Kwame goes into these places, these places that are seemingly invisible but always present with us, and makes poetry of this embodied archives, of this living archives. Kwame, I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about Wisteria, how you conceived of it, what was central to you in that pursuit as it relates again to archive and embodied history.
Yeah, I think I like to make a distinction between, and this is always my caution when I am interviewed or when I see people sort of talking to writers and asking writers to talk about their work. There has to be a recognized difference between how we look at our work in retrospect and sort of say what it has been its effect. And sometimes we reverse engineer that narrative, sometimes to justify what we did, and sometimes even to make sense of what we did. And we should take that all with a pinch of salt, because the truth is that there's not necessarily a direct correlationship between what we say about our work in retrospect and how our work came to come about, right? So that's one sort of, I leave that as a kind of cautionary articulation before I say anything else. And the second one is, I have a vested interest, as most writers do, to elevate my genius by speaking about it in retrospect with the kind of sense of calculation and effort, or with the incredibly beautiful thing that poets like of mystery and magic as part of the rationale for my work, and so on and so forth. So again, whatever I say here, take with a pinch of salt. And finally, I forget stuff, so that's what happens. But I can say that Wisteria has its experience in retrospect that I am encountering like anybody else. But its genesis was not extremely complicated and not far outside what happens to me as a writer at all stages. In other words, what makes me write things, and so on and so forth. The poems that came out of Wisteria did not come out of an agenda, except for me to make sense of an experience that I was having. That is, I was being bombarded with information, feelings, experience, and so on. And somehow I find poetry an opportunity for me to rehearse that, to sort of process it, work it through, and to find some kind of music from it. That's the impulse, right? So the more calculated part of Wisteria was that I met, I was working as a recent immigrant to the United States in a small town in South Carolina called Sumter, and we became part of that community. And one of the things I did sort of directly was to go to the black side of town to work in a resource center where African Americans over generations have used it as a space in which to get support and to get work and so on. And we did as a family essentially become close to that community. Did work, they went to church there and did things like that in that space. And so while doing some workshops with kids and so on and so forth, it became clear to me that it was a community of older African American women, especially, who came through the center for support for different things. And I became sort of obsessively fascinated with this fundamental question. I calculated their ages, and I figured that many of them grew up in the middle of Jim Crow. They were pre-civil rights marches. This was before the 50s and the 60s. So they were living in Jim Crow, South Carolina, in the 30s and the 40s. And it struck me, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it struck me that their narrative of their life just did not exist in any kind of sort of present way. We understood the memory of the civil rights movement and those who were involved in it. But for many of these women, the civil rights movement was a youth movement, and they were grown women. So I became obsessively fascinated by asking them, what are y'all thinking about all of this? Like, and now looking back, how did you feel about all of this? And so I decided to interview them and just ask them, literally to ask them to get into their business. That was my goal. And my goal was also to elevate their stories so that I could work with their grandchildren who were giving me a hard time. And when I asked them a question and I said, why don't you ask your grandmother? They said things like, well, they don't know nothing, and so on. And I said, well, okay, so there's a generational informational gap going on. So that my goal was to interview them, get the recordings, ask them tough questions about race, about the struggle, about how to live in a white culture, and how they dealt with it, and play that back for the kids. That was it, straight up, my project. I didn't plan to write an essay, I didn't plan to publish it, I didn't plan to write any poems, I just wanted to interview them and then use that in this conversation. So then I started interviewing them, and they were willing to talk, and they let me get into their business, and they responded to it, and it was beautiful and it was wonderful. But every night I went home haunted by these stories because they were disturbing, they were alarming, they were beautiful, they were complex. And to process that, to work through that, I started writing these poems. And so Wisteria emerges out of this encounter with an existing archive that hadn't been reckoned with, and that hadn't been collated, that hadn't been positioned, hadn't been placed, and so on. But it was a personal archive of experiences of women with PhDs to women who were domestic servants all their lives. This was a range of women who were talking about, Black women who were talking about their experience, and a few of the Black men. So that's where Wisteria comes out of. But Wisteria was my welcome, but their willingness to talk to me represented a massive crossing of the Atlantic, because and a massive crossing from Jamaica to South Carolina, because the intimacy that they shared with me was a welcome. Because in a sense, as when I started to share this with their families, they thanked me, the families thanked me, because they said these women had never even told them some of these stories. So there was a way in which that physically and emotionally opened the door of a welcoming, a kind of embrace that helped me articulate even better this Pan-African idea, which was in my head, but physically enacted in this moment, that we as Black people have come through a certain kind of narrative that is interconnected. It's not exclusive, but it's interconnected and valuable and sort of has meaning. So that's how Wisteria really came about. And don't forget because it sounds brilliant, so maybe I'm just making this up too, because you should never take what a writer says as gospel, because we make up stuff all the while. But even if it's made up, it's a good story. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
Can I ask a
great.
question? Kwame, these women were aware that you were making this transatlantic connection from Jamaica to South Carolina?
Yeah, they absolutely knew that I was not South Carolinian.
Do you think
They
that
knew that I wasn't American. That may have opened the door for them. That may have made them more comfortable. Yeah. But I was also very present in the center. So I think what it allowed me to do was to ask them sort of almost impertinent, intimate questions like, who were you in love with? And these are women with dignity, and you're talking about love and talking about babies and so on. They just chuckled and then just talked. But one of the things that was said, and it's a good thing you asked that, Greg, was I remember a woman called Rosie Richardson, and she said, I've been silent all this time, but now is my turn. I'm just gonna say what I feel. And her big crossover moment was to be able to say to me about white people, she says, I don't like them. I never did, and I never could. But I've never said that out loud. But she said, when will I not have a chance? How long will I continue to not say what has been guiding my life all this time? And that was not the summation of everything around it, but what she's saying is, that's a haunting reality that has been constantly reinforced by what has happened to me, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, time after time and after time again. It was very, very, very moving and very powerful. And for her, it was massively painful to even say that. So sometimes it is access, it is the opportunity of a kind of lack of pressure from somebody who is in the community. But sometimes it's purely opportunity. It's just, you caught me at the moment when I had something to say, and I'm gonna say it.
I was imagining myself asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And again, talk about the kind of archive that I'm carrying around as evidence, right? I look into my archive and I hear, boy, this is grown folks' business, right? We don't talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing, and that opportunity. I mean, keep in mind that I've done this work in sort of journalistic ways. It's sort of crossing into communities like HIV communities in Jamaica, where there's silence and protectiveness, in Haiti, even going back in Ghana. There's a point at which you sort of you're working with the idea of pressing the question, even though there are certain assumptions you all think you have. You know what I mean? So I think that was one part of it. But the other part of it was translation, right? So whereas when a woman said to me, we like to bank the potatoes during the winter. And I said, bank the potatoes? And she said, you don't know what banking potatoes is? I said, I don't know what banking potatoes is. You tell me what banking potatoes is. And she gives me one of the most beautiful descriptions of what to bank a potato is. Now, somebody who knew the term would never get that description because I'm saying, I don't know what it is. And I learned to then be ignorant and willfully ignorant, even if I thought I knew. If I thought I knew what Jim Crow was like, I put that behind me and said, let me pretend right in this moment that I've never seen this thing, and I'm going to push you to tell me really, really what it was all about. But that's a calculation, that's a craft choice to see how that can generate a kind of freedom for articulation and so on. So I think it's an interesting, it's a great lesson for a writer to think about, to not assume too much because of what we have. This is a natural inclination, but to let what comes to us come as pure as possible, and then we sort of work our way through.
It's a question of audience too when we get to the page, because we're also assuming we have the certain cultural assumptions that we think we share with the reader.
Right.
And so we're assuming that the reader already knows X, Y, and Z. And that prevents us in many regards from getting to a more granular level of description. We, in our own writing practice, we gloss over what it means to bank the potatoes.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the beautiful thing the thing that I always keep in mind with this Wisteria project is what is foregrounded now, of course, is the books, the poems. But then we did a musical performance of it. But there's still the archive of the actual recordings, which I have. And another writer could come to that same material and find completely different things to create from and to draw from. Their voices speaking their lives now has been collected. They've been collected in a way that is available or can be made available to other people to react to, both family, alien people from other places, and so on and so forth. So I'm very careful about regarding what I've constructed, that is what I've derived from it as a poet, as the be all and end all of the narrative, that I'm not writing history now, I'm writing a lyrical engagement with history. Mm-hmm. Fact is more important, yes, because I don't share Richard Hugo's sort of blasé dismissal of fact. I think fact is important. I think for the dismissal of the value of fact is I think a privilege that some of us just don't have. And who knows, maybe one day we will. So fact is important. Dates are kind of useful because they place things in a context, but there has to be an admission that this is a boy guy who was born in Ghana, came to Jamaica, that I'm the one sort of meeting these women, and that lyric sense of that personal experience is also sort of, but I mean, it's something that I think guides. I mean, you wrote your nonfiction work exploring a very intimate issue, and what I love about how you wrestle with it is that you're constantly dancing between articulating the intimacy of your parents, your father's relationship and so on, but the historical moment, right? Constantly doing both things at the same time. The pressure of responsibility in both senses, I think demonstrates the same kind of consideration. I think that would be important.
Yeah. No, that's a great example, because I was thinking, as you were talking about how you should not trust the poet's own description of his or her own work. And the same goes again internally, where when I write the memory, my writing of the memory then replaces all the possibilities that memory had prior to its inscription.
Yeah.
And I think when we contribute to the collective archive in our texts, in our poems, and in our work, there is a tendency for that contribution to stand to concretize and to stand as a kind of exclusive representation of the thing it purports to represent.
It's a tough one.
Oh, sorry.
I was saying it's a tough one. It's an interesting one, because I think in reading your book, though, I sense that you knew this and you were wrestling with it, like explicitly, especially saying, I know I've put this book is here. Like this is the history now. I'm telling you the family's history. I'm the broker of this history. But also being generous about letting those who become stars. I think your father becomes a kind of star in the narrative. His voice to keep present, even when the voice is going completely against anything you think or agree with. You kind of, I admire the way you preserve that. And the way to manage that seemed like a true exercise, I think, in that book. Yeah,
and it opens one up, not just me. It opens one up to being responsible for the statements that one chooses to curate.
That's right.
and so my fear that the reader will construe this as even at the level of the writing self versus the self that moves through society, right? I am constructing a voice that is on the page, and to some degree, I want to allow that voice to be in the moment.
Yeah.
But the danger is that readers are going to expect and equate that voice as not a construct or an artifice,
right,
but as a genuine part of my soul that I carry with me all day long. And that, the voice on the page is not mutable. I am, I can change my mind.
The page is static. The page is static, but the individual, I was reading and then I looked at, I don't know if you've read Natasha's Trethewey's. Oh my goodness, it's powerful, but it wrestles with the same thing, and so she chooses an interesting kind of solution because she was granted some text that her mother actually wrote. And so she lets her voice sort of enter it and just be present throughout the last bit of it. And, it's a great, moving, powerful, difficult story of her mother's murder. But when the mother's voice intervenes and Natasha does not, Trethewey doesn't comment on it, doesn't frame it, just lets it sit. It's a very haunting kind of encounter with history that has been made static by death. You know what I mean? And then locked into this moment. But it returns us to this idea of the idea of the archive has to be conceived of as a liminal space. That is allowing for us to enter into a space which is complex, which is not, which will continue to feed us and to complicate our existence. But our cultures have suffered from the intentional erasure of that range, so that we are narrowed into singular narratives, which I think being writers, just the pure gesture of being writers pushes against. That's why, when I talk about the APBF, I don't talk about it because I talk about it because I'm going for numbers. I want more and more poets published from Africa, not because it's a great number, but because I want all those voices to enter into this conversation and complicate it. Because it's the absence of complication, constrained by a certain kind of worldview, that's one of the things that we struggle with. And that's what makes it so difficult for us. So you open the door, and let the voices become what they are. And then later on, somebody can do their own theories about it and so on and so forth. To me, that is so critical, and that is so important that I can't say it enough. So I'm driven. That's what drives the impulse. That's what drives the instinct. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Their voices speaking their lives, engaging with people who are alive, and even engaging with the dead. Because Greg, like you rightly pointed out in his memoir, and as in Natasha Trethewey's memoir, the voice is now gone, right? But the person who owns the voice has now passed to the other side. But in African imaginary of the world and Black imaginary of the world, the dead are never really dead. The archives, they're here with us, and we carry their voices. I thought maybe we can have you read, little excerpt of your work at this point, and then questions are coming in, and then maybe we'll take one more question after you read the excerpt of your work, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Are you ready to read, Greg?
Greg will have to go first because I wasn't prepared to read, but I'll find something.
Kwame, just short excerpts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna read. Well, how many? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, 5-10 minutes each.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I'll read a few poems from the new project, which I'll set up briefly, and I'm absolutely willing and happy and eager to get further into it if there are questions. I started out, and I'm doing this thing, Kwame, in advance of many of the poems. Is I'm
Right.
and I'm now self-conscious of that. Pointed out this tendency. I'm trying to create a narrative that will carry the poems into the world. But I am conscious of this sense that Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Mike Brown, when in his deposition, he described Mike Brown as a demon rising up before him. Right? And again, back to my fascination with visual agency and the untrustworthiness of sight and of vision. So I went and started looking at other police officers' sort of descriptions. Now we know that the common explanation for shooting an unarmed Black person is, I fear for my life. Armed or unarmed, no matter what the case is, I fear for my life. And we all go, oh, okay, or at least the institutions go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Cool. And so I started looking at the actual depositions in many cases and seeing that consistently there was this kind of not just monsterization, but this language of the supernatural, this recourse to supernatural language, right? Sandra Bland was making furtive movements and disappearing out of view. Someone else had bug eyes like a zombie, and so all these descriptions, and so I became really interested in thinking about the ways that race is witchcraft in America, and I'm certainly not the first person to say that. And there's a considerable scholarship that is looking at that, and so that's kind of motivating the overall project. I will start with one poem. Tituba was the well, we're not sure what her identity or racial identity was, but she was certainly the woman of color in during the Salem witch trials who was not hung, and she gave witness, and all of the implications of that were very fascinating to me. So this is called Tituba. If not the labor, then the womb. If not the womb, a witch. If not a witch, a dead witch. Justice in search of a crime. To be hung for witchcraft in 1692, one need only deny guilt. And yet, of all the innocents, that she should live. In Judge Haythorn's court, what did she think to become? She could be a jellyfish floating in the fireplace, quicksilver in moonlight, the tumescence of smoke. Non-white and woman, she finessed those coordinates given to her like stigmata. After auction blocks and meeting house pews, the witness stand was child's play. Like the English peasant magic she learned, egg whites in water, evoking things unseen. She learned to be the genie in their mirror and assumed forms they'd comprehend, forms to feed the hunger of their judgment. She confessed. The night the dog's voice slowed from piccolo to profundo, she glimpsed the devil's registry. Presiding, she pronounced their own names back to them aloud, each like a feathered reptile set free as she damned them, one by one, midwifing their souls through her mouth like a god. Sorry for the Brooklyn background music. there's this idea of kayfabe is a professional wrestling term. I'm not a pro wrestling fan, but I was really fascinated with kayfabe. Kayfabe is the pact that professional wrestlers have, that they will the promise that they'll stay in character no matter what happens, and that this is they will always inhabit this world, even outside of the ring. In 1999, there was a professional wrestler named Owen Hart who was making this descent into the ring. He was making this grand entrance, and something went wrong, and he fell and he died. And so I'm thinking about kayfabe and this intersection of the fake and the real. Kayfabe, 1999. Professional wrestler Owen Hart briefly became his own omen when he battled gravity from rafters to canvas in a Kansas City stadium. The greatest hoax is the one that isn't. He fell without warning. No hoverboard, no hummingbirds, finesse for the illusion of flight, no suspension of disbelief to cast his agony, the birth of virtue, in a virtual reality. His planned angelic entrance eclipsed when his safety harness failed. He fell out of the air sats like a wax wing duped by infinities conjured in a squeegee's mirage. Spectators wilted as the creature of grief emerged to graze on their sapling gasps and shrieks. I want to imagine he kept faith with the crowd, his mask as his shield, until he arrived at his fatal conclusion, and didn't spend his last in attempts to method Zeno's proofs. EMTs, like evangelicals, huddled to spoke the hub of Hart's radiating soul, as fans prayed the stunt might yet parade the emperor's threads wrestlers call kayfabe. Kayfabe, a dialect of Pig Latin, lingo for the promise to drop at the laying on of hands, to take myth as history, semblance as creed, to be in the silence, the beginning of art, between error and a world needless of forgiveness and regret. So another kind of direction that I've been moving toward is, I have this